This is the battle for your frontal lobe, and we are our next talk. We are going to be bringing out two special people. Some of you that may remember that earlier this year, I should say, we had Dr. Peter McCullough come and be our keynote speaker. One of the people we are bringing back is one of the people that was on the panel with him and was able to be questioned by Peter himself. Dr. Perez is a neuroscientist passionate about uncovering the mechanisms of how the human brain can change to heal itself after trauma and pathology, especially through regulation of cellular metabolic processes. During his doctoral training at Loma Linda University School of Medicine, he studied bidirectional interactions between the nervous system and circulating immune cells. And the next speaker that will also be coming out with him at the same time, if we have a neuroscientist with us, we will also have a psychiatrist. Rhoda J. Gottfried is a trained board-certified psychiatrist currently practicing in the state of Maryland and Washington, D.C. She received her medical degree from Loma Linda University School of Medicine and her adult psychiatry residency from the same institution, and her child and adolescent psychiatric training at Johns Hopkins University. Please put your hands together for our next two people that are coming out right now.
Hello, everyone. We're so pleased to be here this afternoon. Excited, really. All these wonderful talks that we have witnessed. What a blessing, right?
It's a blessing. It's a blessing to be here.
Indeed. We thank the organizers of this event. We're so glad to be part of it. Ivan and your staff, his staff, thank you for inviting us. We also thank the people from the Encounter. The Ark Encounter. Wonderful hosts, and we're enjoying it so far, right? Thank you. So, on this opportunity, we have this weight on us to share the science behind the brain that yearns to connect with his creator or its creator. It's such a topic. So, we're going to ask the Holy Spirit to allow us to unpack it for you. It's our passion, both my wife's and I, but we want to share it in such a way that it brings and it builds our spirits. Let's bow our heads. Dear Lord, please open our minds to this wonderful creation of yours known as the brain. It is the organ by which you give us your message, your will, the desires you have for us. Allow us to understand how it can be healed because you have put things in it, the mechanisms to return to what you created it originally. We ask for your presence in Jesus' name. Amen. So we will start with a question. Why was Noah the one able to hear God and trust him in his generation? After all, he was the only one with his family to enter the ark and be saved. Look at that wooden ship. I always think we wonder about the situation in which we think of the ark as this strange object in a technological era. We don't know how the world before the flood was. But can you imagine? I just leave it there. And basically, in essence, what we have here is a comparison of two mindsets. One is self-centered. It uses a self-centered brain. It's a stressed brain because it has to put self before others. You see? It has to exert its will. It's about me, my pleasure, my designs, my goals, right? Who cares about yours? And it wants to impose the will over others. They're very self-centered, as opposed to Noah's. Noah has surrendered to the will of God. He has submitted his will to the point that, as we see in the picture, he was building a ship to bring others with him besides the animals. Think about that. The best example we have on brains that function in this manner is this graph. So say, for instance, the brain on lust, known as hormonal love. Look at the areas of that brain. The hypothalamus and the pituitary gland are exemplified. Those are areas that release hormones that go through the system, and they create this need for the same effects. In other words, it's very basic. And it kind of incentivizes the craving of more and more for the same effects. Where opposed to the brain on love, which we call altruistic love, the brain areas, you see that the orange structures in this brain, those are that depicts the limbic system. We have the hippocampus, the amygdala, same centers that of awareness. We have the thalamus, hypothalamus, but it doesn't end there. They communicate with cortical areas, higher brain structures. So this is a holistic love. And so in this picture, you can see the involvement of the brain that loves, truly loves. So we're going to discuss the culturally driven values in our generation, just in the same manner as it was back in Noah's days. Think about this: pride, passion, and pleasure. 3 P's. My wife received the Holy Spirit and she came up with this thing. And I go, wow, this encapsulates precisely what the culture yearns for right now. So we summarized it. By no means these are the only ones, but this is summarized because it gave us the opportunity to really go into the red zone, influenced by the devil. So imagine when one is proudful and has pride, he or she would become isolated, leading to a passion. The exertion of passion, meaning to assert one's will, that will lead to anger and despair. And anger and despair uses a lot of energy, doesn't it? You bet. It's very hormonal. Stress hormones are released and so on. And people tend to self-medicate or to flee to pleasurable activities. Whew. So that is pleasure, but it will lead to addiction. So that revolving seeking of the same thrill will set in. But God has an antidote. We'll bring this at the end of our talk. Where there's pride, there can be submission with God's help. When there's passion, patience can sit in so that we can relate to others. When there's pleasure, that can be tamed by God's Spirit and lead to a trust and connection with a Creator.
Have you ever changed your mind? Understanding truth, is it intellectual or is it emotional? Most neuroscientists would say that understanding truth is mostly emotional. We think that something is right or wrong. We feel it emotionally, and then we make a rationalization about what we already feel. And that is not what God calls us to do. As the last speaker talked about, we do have a rational faith. We can employ the frontal lobe functioning. And I've heard this over and over in this conference, and it's been so great to hear that our talk goes along with what others have already said. A number of people have already said what we are going to say. The frontal lobe is able to decide, judge, reason, decide what's right and wrong. We were given this power by God to think and to choose right from wrong. Most neuroscientists actually don't believe in freedom of choice. But I do believe in freedom of choice. I think there's a lot of reason to believe that. And we have to make moral judgment. How do you know what is true? How do you know? Well, one is the Bible, and I've heard that over and over in this conference today, and I believe in the Bible. What does it take to change your mind? It's evidence. God has laid the evidence out of his love in the stories of the Bible. Could anything that you believe today be wrong? Well, in medical school, the first year of medical school, I've never forgotten this lecture where one of the professors said 50% of what you learn in medical school is false. We just don't know which 50%. So they taught us a heuristic of medicine, how to decide what is true and what is false, how to get the evidence. And there's a lot of emphasis now on evidence-based medicine. But evidence can be faked also. So we have to use discernment. AI does not know how to weight evidence. Over 50% of social science research, I think it's closer to 80%, is not replicatable. In other words, when they do a study, they get a result, then someone else does the same similar study, trying to use the same parameters, they're not getting the same result. So there's what's called a replication crisis in social science. And then we have Professor John Ioannidis, I don't think I say his name right, empirically quantifying the reliability of medical research. This paper has been downloaded more than any other paper in published science. This particular paper, I think it was published in 2004 or 2006, somewhere in there. But it's the most ever downloaded paper, so you might want to look it up. But according to his calculations, most peer-reviewed research, even peer-reviewed literature, is in fact false. So again, we have to use discernment even when we're looking at literature. And it takes a lot to really know what is true and what is false. But one thing that I wanted you to remember and say, and if you want to, I'm going to say it and then, maybe we'll say it together. But trust requires truth. Trust requires truth. That is something so important. We have to have truth. And we have to train our minds to discern what is truth and what is error. And the brain, this was already covered by the speaker Frank Cohen. He already covered how unbelievably complex the brain is in his talk, and I learned something from his talk. I always say it's 82 billion neurons in your brain, but he said it's 86 billion, so I'm inclined to believe that. But at any case, there's 80 some billion neurons in your brain. Each of those neurons has about 10,000 connections. So, many connections. And everything we do in psychiatry has to do with the connection between two neurons. The synapse, the neurotransmitter, the chemical that takes the signal from one neuron to another. That's everything we do as far as medication goes has to do with that. And that's what we think the medication is doing, affecting the synapse, the communication between two neurons. So your brain is incredibly complex. It's the most complex thing that science knows about, and it's the most complex organ in your body. And if anything is affecting your body's health, it's going to affect your brain first, because you have all these chemical reactions and connections. So a small difference in connectivity can add up to multiply across many connections and make a big difference. So it's these connections that are important to understand. So every thought, every feeling, every behavior that you have is a connection of neurons in your brain, right? You have a thought, it's a connection of neurons in your brain. We all have certain patterns of thought, feeling, and behavior. And every time we go down that thought, we connect those neurons more closely. That's what happens physically. So we change our brain every time we have an experience. When you leave this lecture, your brain will be different than when you started this lecture, right? Otherwise, you'd go away from this lecture, you wouldn't remember anything. that we did in this lecture. So your brain physically changes all the time. That's called neuroplasticity. And as it connects, as you practice something, learn something new, as you connect those neurons, then those pathways get faster, right? And so, things that you've done before are faster to do, easier to do, quicker to do than something new that you have to use more energy to connect.
Here I'd like to show you the structures of the brain that regulate the emotions and the areas that regulate those emotions in the same brain. As Rhoda said, these regions have to connect with each other through pathways. So if I can point, but look at the red where it says amygdala. That is the center that God put in there for our awareness of danger. Isn't it nice? I bet the amygdala started to fire when Eve approached the tree, the forbidden, for the forbidden fruit. So there was an awareness that something she needed to pay attention to or be careful for. The hippocampus is the structure next to it that contextualize from previous memories. And of course, the hypothalamus, as we already discussed, is the one that creates the awareness globally or systemically. If these three structures are engaged repeatedly, they override the effects of the more executive functions, such as the prefrontal and orbital cortex. That creates the production of stress hormones. The stress hormones are deleterious to the connections that go to the frontal cortex, literally shrinking the pathways there.
Chronically elevated.
And the chronic elevation of these levels, cortisol, by the way, that stress hormones will cause the pruning of the pathways that connect to the frontal cortex. So there's shrinkage of the brain or the tissue. And this was demonstrated in models of addiction, of these key interacted brain circuitry. So here's a study that demonstrates this. Look at the prefrontal cortex in the big box. That regulates straight regulation to the areas of reward in green. You see the ventral tegmental area, it's in the limbic system, and it modulates the reward system there. And then the other box is small in the non-addicted brain, which is a dorsal striatum. It's for the impulses that contextualize, and then the seeking of that reward, that behavior portion. And of course, the amygdala and hippocampus are going to be attenuated. This is a normal functioning of the brain with the prefrontal cortex exerting control here. That's not what we see in an addictive brain. Look at the reversal of roles there, or consequences. The PFC prefrontal cortex is shrunk, and it doesn't exert that control over the reward system, which is big now. And so that creates this loop of constant contextualized activation, where the amygdala and hippocampus flare up and say, give me, give me, give me. I need to feel it more and more, and enlarges. And that is the physiology of a brain that is dysregulated.
So if you've been accused of a crime, what do you want the judge to do? You've been wrongly accused of a crime. You've been arrested. You're going before the judge. Would you like the judge to consult his instinct? Do you want the judge to check her feelings? We have a culture that's based on feelings. And fundamentally, people become their own worst judge. When they have depression, they're saying, well, I must be bad. If I feel bad, I must be bad, right? There's a loop there. If I hear a voice and it's telling me to kill myself, I guess I should do it. If I hear something and I feel like the FBI is out to get me and I have to, hide and do all kinds of strange things, if I feel it's true, it must be true. This is how people are often functioning. But we have to have a way to break that up. We have to have a fundamental disbelief of this idea that because I feel something means it's true. If you are accused of a crime, you are going to want the judge to consult the evidence. And if you are innocent of the crime, you want the evidence to show that. You want the evidence that shows you are innocent. And we want to consult the evidence, not our feelings or our feelings only. In order to discern truth from error, you have to exercise the brain, study, exercise the brain to recognize truth versus error. And the study of the Bible is a very good way to improve the functioning of the frontal lobe. Your brain needs practice to determine. This is what we did in medical school. We needed practice to determine and to understand the difference between what's appropriate evidence and what's, fraudulent evidence. AI could remove people's ability to think altogether for themselves if they're constantly relying on something else thinking for them, asking a question of Google, getting the answer, not really studying it for themselves. Like a muscle, your brain becomes flabby when it's not challenged and when you don't study. People used to go to Sabbath school or Sunday school and really study and talk and have questions, present different things they were thinking about. I don't see people doing that as much anymore as maybe they are where you are, but we really need to, do these things because just like we have to go to the gym to keep our muscles in shape, we have to study to show ourselves approved unto God. It won't be long before AI mimics a human brain, some people say, and we already heard from Frank Cohen that, maybe this is overblown, which I would tend to agree with. And but we can also automate evil. Like AI cannot determine what's good and what's bad. It only goes by what the programmer bias. And a lot of things in our society and our culture now are captured by ideology. And unfortunately, even medical institutions largely have been captured by ideology over evidence. And we've seen this come out this year in March of 2024. The WPATH files were put out. These are leaked emails from one of the health organizations, so-called. And these have shown that this is an activist organization posing as a healthcare organization. I would encourage you to read this for yourself and don't take someone else's word for what this says. The CAS review also has come out this year. This also shows ideology has taken over a lot of the medical institutions over evidence. And it's a pulling back in the United Kingdom, they're pulling back from some of the more radical things that they have been doing.
Unfortunately, as a nation, we have experienced medical challenges, continue to experience them, but not too long ago, 4 years ago, you know what happened. And overtaken with fear, the population accepted technology that had been in practice in the laboratories, but had not been implemented clinically. And we know that now, as mRNA vaccines, the vaccine technology. So within a year or under a year, that technology was accepted for use in humans, as you know. And some of us experience painful loss of loved ones. And that has brought the public in the US to mistrust and fear also of the evidence, to the point that there's an increasing percentage or a declining percentage of Americans, I should say, according to the Pew Research Center, that are likely to get vaccinated, as you see, regardless of their political affiliation or whether they sympathize with one political side or not. And this is a clear example of the mistrust and fear that is sitting in the population, driving this situation. And I want to name also that going back in years in the 50s, some of you may remember, a few of you perhaps, but the big lobotomy craze of the 50s, it was accepted as science by experts who would perform procedures through, inserting this surgical instruments through the orbital, to the eyes, and performing ablations of the tissue and the frontal cortex. And that was accepted as something that could perhaps produce positive outcomes. They were documented as just numbers here. Case 624, simple schizophrenia patients make nice household pets after operations. Yet the evidence shown in the photos show a different reality. There was a change of brains that was happening. Now, I don't have to go in detail to eugenics. You know what eugenics is. Now, that was in the 30s. And eugenics basically was advocated as something good for society, for improvement. Now, in the 60s, some of you would also recall the tragic reality of the Bremer siblings with gender reassignment postnatally. Anyway, you can Google that for yourself, but they had been medical blunders. Our point is not, we're in the field, but our point is not to be negative. It's just to invite everyone to engage reasoning. This lead us to a question that is very important for all of us. Is your cup full? Is my cup full? Is our cup full? Imagine the cup being as our mental processes, our spirits, our emotions in one cup. Every individual craves for belonging and meaning and for the truth. Isn't that truth? Isn't that a reality? Our current generation is one that is inwardly focused, as what we depicted in the beginning, right? Self-seeking, it's inwardly, with the use of with partying, with the overwhelming weight of substances to self-medicate, or drugs, as we call it, drug addiction, with music that has to be blaring behind us. You go to malls. Here I'm depicting one, a parlor, when you go for haircuts. I went the other day and it had music. Who cares about the lyrics? They can be the most inappropriate lyrics as long as we have something going, a beat. Or it could be the aftermath of casual sex. Or it can be substance use combined with alcohol, but most tragic, the use of media among our young. Aren't we all susceptible to this? Even when we are surrounded by our peers, we can be susceptible to isolate ourselves. But all of these activities lead to the release of dopamine. How many of you have heard of dopamine, the reward hormone, right? Well, its mechanism is such, and I just want to summarize this because dopamine is such a complex neurotransmitter that is released by these four pathways. In blue, that dopamine informs the cortical areas that a reward is happening, so that those areas can be engaged to regulate that substance, that practice, that activity that is causing the release of dopamine, right? Whatever it is. Also, and we have also the mesolimbic pathway, which goes to the reward centers because it has to self-regulate there. It has to make connections. And it has to inform the dopamine release as well. In the yellow, we have the basal ganglia informed as well. You see that pathway, short but important, and contextualize this activity that is producing dopamine. And lastly, the green, which is the neuroendocrinal that releases other hormones. So this system must be in connection with each other. Four pathways that have been studied. On the other panel, I just want to tell you what I want to highlight just two main points. You see that floating between neurons, the green neuron with the big dendritic neuron there in purple or lavender color, and there's a floating of dopamine. Release of dopamine causes this the its transport back to the neurons, which is like a recycling mechanism. It stops, and so there's a floating of dopamine in that synaptic space that elicits a signaling mechanism to the neurons. And in the middle, right there in the box, you see their gene activity. The mechanism for this gene activity is basically epigenetics. How many of you have heard of epigenetics? That means circumventing the normal gene expression path, steps. In other words, it's a temporary turning on and off of genes. And that produces lasting, or not lasting, but temporary changes in the brain with lasting consequences if the behavior or the stimulus producing dopamine is not taken away. And hence we have that brain that is changed, conditioned to that behavior that is producing the pleasure without the regulation of the prefrontal cortex. Even secular psychiatrists such as Dr. Lemke suggest that the widespread use of pain-relieving psychotropic drugs may be causing more harm than good, and is calling for a more regulatory measures to attenuate the widespread use of these drugs. But any activity that causes dopamine release can alter this circuitry that we just studied.
So another book by Goldhammer and Lyle, The Pleasure Trap, is a good one to look at. It's looking at food specifically, but you can apply it to any dopamine high activity. So hyper pleasurable, hyper palatable foods, hyper novelty. Isn't that our world? Hyper novelties, online, pornography, you name it. People can go to the nth degree on hyper novelty, hyper pleasure. So when you get in that enhanced pleasure zone with hyper palatable foods, for example, you get neuronal adaptation. So neuronal adaptation means that the neuron has to protect itself from the hyperstimulation, and it has to decrease the receptors for dopamine in this case. So when it decreases the receptors for dopamine, normal pleasure activities like doing a good job at work, going on a nature walk, having a fun time with your family, these feel like low pleasure when you've been in the high pleasure zone, right? So this is what drives that seeking of pleasure. And so you get reduced receptors for dopamine, and you have to really go down to dopamine fasting in order to reverse that enhanced pleasure zone experience, and reduce your go back to a normal dopamine receptor level. So again, God's antidote for the ills of our culture, pride, passion, pleasure, are submission to his will. And I got this from Spirit of Prophecy, from doing a devotion I was reading. Submission, patience, and trust. You cannot have trust, though, without truth. You can't have trust without truth. So Jesus gives us the truth.
We can do this because God has created the mechanisms for doing this. It is known as neuroplasticity, the rewiring of the brain. Now, this is not a new concept. Some of you know about this. But here's a summary of how the brain is able to go back to a balanced state. And it has two modes of molecular at the molecular level and cellular level. The molecular level has to do precisely with what we have talked about just in 2 slides ago, and that the signaling pathways and the epigenetics can reverse things that have happened to the point that you, if you were susceptible to alcoholism and you changed and you have a child after that, the, that predisposition is not there, or you can pass bad habits, but that person, the son, your son or child, if reverses that behavior, may not pass it on to your grandchild. So it's a generational thing. The change that happens within generations, that's a miracle. It was not known before. They said your dad is an alcoholic, so will you be, and your child. Not true. Thanks to that rearrangement, the neuroplasticity, the power of these events at the cellular level, neuronal, dendritic, and synaptic connections between these neurons also healed by the mechanisms outlined in the boxes. Neurogenesis, we're going to learn some activities that yield with the neurogenesis, the sprouting of new neurons. That's amazing. When I was an undergrad, they'd tell us, don't damage your neurons because you lose them forever. Not true. Well, certain areas of the brain will undergo neurogenesis, new sprouting of of neurons. But that's for another talk. We have some presentations about this. Now, what are some of the activities that can promote this rewiring of the brain or healing of the brain? Here's some. There's several. But we have chose this slide because the science is waking up to study them. Isn't that amazing? Well, some of us knew what to do, but be inspired. The Bible has hinted, Spirit of Prophecy has hinted to some of this. Yet science is turning on in the last 5 to 10 years. And here we present the evidence. So we have some of the reviews and also references for practice and devotion. Not meditation, just practice and devotion. Engaging the whole brain, the cortical areas for reasoning, understanding, and in response to the emotions produced for that deep connection with our Creator holistically, it enhances and restores the brain connections. Also, the dopamine regulation. Have you heard of dopamine fasting? Well, that's one aspect, but we put a scale there with another molecule, which is serotonin. So dopamine is on your left and serotonin on the right. Very similar in chemical structures. Serotonin is the molecule that is activated to put some break to dopamine as necessary to contextualize in the brain. It helps to put brakes to the effects of dopamine. So it must be restored. So there's a balance that must be restored. Self-temperance. Self-temperance is an active behavior. All of these have citations there that have demonstrated, and we have, Rhoda and I have really investigated this carefully because the evidence can be biased, right? So we do the work to really identify the best references that are analytical enough and balanced. And so self-temperance takes practice. Just like if you want to learn a skill, you have to practice. So there's a will to be enhanced. The pathways get strengthened by the constant practice. Isn't that amazing? Regular exercise. I don't have to say much about this. The literature is very clear, and they were summarized in 2023 in an extensive review, where regular exercise, besides promoting neurogenesis, it kind of promotes this specialized inroads with new vessels that are very efficient, so that the pruning and sprouting of neurons happens, and then that leads to an efficient strengthening of the neurons. And they've been tested cognitively with these amazing results in the elderly of all people. So the elderly, please walk every day, and not anywhere. You can walk out in nature, and it's a double effect. During the pandemic, a study came out there in the International Journal of Environment Research and Public Health. We practiced it too. Every Sabbath, we used to go walking in the woods. And we don't. And there's amazing, amazing literature that came out about the oils and aromas that come from trees. Probably you heard about those. Nature walk is amazing. We were driving here on the highway, and my eyes focused. My wife was driving it, and my eyes focused on the foliage and trees. And it was such a depthness. It was doing something to my brain. It's just awoken me, and it was exciting to see. Nature work has many benefits. One of them is restoring those connections in the brain. Can you believe that? It's all there. Balanced diet. We can go on and on with this. We have talks, a couple of talks on this, and the seminars that we presented before. But I'm showing one of my studies there directly in which we tested micronutrients in a cocktail. What we know, whole foods, but it was micronutrients produced by expensive methods by a pharmaceutical. I'm sorry, by an industry, and we tested it in old mice to test their cognitive results. And we found out that it had improved compared to controls on learning tasks over a 5-day period. Well, if it can be done in animal models in the laboratory, I'm sure it can be done in humans. I'm sure it's having the same effect. That is amazing. And so all these things are activities that can really promote health.
Theory says you have to change your body to fit your mind. Jesus says he created you and he loves you. Theory says it's bigoted to want to heal people like you. Jesus says his healing love is for everyone, including you. Theory says you are part of a group collective. Jesus says you are an individual he created. Theory says desire is the highest law. Jesus says he has an overwhelming desire for you. Theory promises things it can never deliver. Jesus' promises are more than you could ever dream of. Theory tells you to perform. Jesus offers you rest. Theory is no future, only death. Jesus promises eternal life. At the cross, Jesus demonstrated that he is trustworthy. And the theories of this world lead to mutilation of children. In other words, he volunteered to assume our nature to demonstrate that a brain committed to the will of its creator has nothing to fear and willingly lay his own life for his friends, and that's us. He wants us to be his friend.
So we ask again, fill my cup, Lord. Now we tell him to fill our cup, Lord. That mind that he has endowed us with, to be restored and to be filled by his knowledge. I didn't say just to get emotions and be motivated by emotions, but both reason and emotions, because the pathways are there. The pathways for connection and truth can be found by engaging our whole brain. We want to leave you with this prayer. We're nearing Sabbath, but this is something that we must always, always claim. If my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven, and I will forgive their sins, and I will heal their land. I hope that our reflection on the mechanisms of the brain to engage and restore health, mental health, were inspiring to you, and please practice those things that would enable the connections to be restored. Thank you.